Thank you, President Patty. Our speaker today is our U.S. Senator Pat Toomey, and this is Pat's third time visiting our club. He came in 2009 as a candidate and returned, as promised, as a sitting U.S. Senator in 2013. As you all are aware, our intention was to have another program with Democratic candidate Katie McGinty. And while her campaign stated early that she would like the opportunity to address the club, we found out on Monday that ultimately she was not able to utilize any of these 6 dates that we offered to her. Just a little background on the speaker who is here. Pat grew up the third of 6 children in a blue-collar working-class family. His father, a union worker, his mother, a part-time secretary at the family church. Pat was taught the values of hard work, self-reliance, and his dedication and discipline as a student earned him entry into Harvard University. Upon graduating from Harvard, Pat spent 6 years working in the international capitals market in the financial services field. When Pat left the financial sector in 1990, he and his 2 younger brothers became entrepreneurs, starting a successful family-owned restaurant business with several Pennsylvania locations. In 1997, Pat successfully ran and won the open seat representing Pennsylvania's 15th Congressional District for 3 consecutive terms. In office, Pat was one of Congress's leading advocates for limited government and personal freedom. He led the effort to expand tax cuts and reduce wasteful spending. Honoring a campaign pledge, Pat did not seek re-election in his 3rd term. Following his service in Congress, Pat served as president of the limited government free enterprise advocacy organization, the Club for Growth. As mentioned, in 2009, then candidate Toomey spoke to our club and was elected as one of Pennsylvania's U.S. Senators. The Senator serves on the Finance, the Banking, and the Budget Committees. Senator Toomey has obviously become a leading voice within Congress on economic, financial services, and budgetary issues. Pat has used his accumulated knowledge to help write and enact the Bipartisan Jobs Act, which cuts regulatory burdens on small and medium-sized businesses, making it easier to raise capital and create jobs. Pat lives in Zionsville, Pennsylvania, with his wife Chris and their 3 children. And while we welcome our very long list of guests with us today, following his presentation, we do ask that respectful questions for the Senator Toomey to be reserved for the members of our Rotary Club of Europe. Fellow retainers and guests, please warmly welcome United States Senator Pat Toomey.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that warm reception once again. And Mike, thank you for that kind introduction. I understand this is the 100th year anniversary of this. Is that right, Mike?
Yep.
Of this Rotary Club. That is amazing. That is impressive. Congratulations. Civic clubs have been in decline in America for a long time, and you guys are doing something that's really neat to be able to continue to thrive 100 years later. I'm a little bit familiar with this kind of organization because I spent years as a Sertoman. I was a member of the Sertoman Club of Allentown for many years, and I will just admit one thing. You guys sing better than but it's great to be back, and I do appreciate the invitation to join you one more time. If you're watching TV these days, you may have seen some campaign ads. Anybody seen any campaign ads? It's amazing, isn't it? I'll tell you, it's when the ads are running with this frequency, one of the things that happens is, of course, you get recognized. So if I'm walking down the street now to a much, much greater extent than ever before, people will recognize me from all the TV ads. Now, when you combine that fact with Congress's about, say, 10% approval rating, it can lead to some awkward conversation. I'll give you an example. The other day I was at the Home Depot with my son. We're walking down the aisle, and the guy's coming the other way, and he walks up to me and he says, hey, has anyone ever told you you look a lot like Pat Toomey? So I said, yeah, I've heard that. He said, it must be infuriating. Well, welcome to my world. but there's only 3 weeks left, and then TV goes back to normal. I'm looking forward to that, as many of us are. Let me just make a few observations. I'm looking forward to your questions, but you know, Bernie Sanders is a guy with whom I disagree on almost everything. Okay, Bernie Sanders and I actually get along with Bernie. I like Bernie. We sit on the budget committee together. But I disagree with the vast majority of his policy proposals. But I think he made an observation that's not entirely incorrect. I think he was onto something when he said that we have two economies. And I think what he means by that, at least my perception, is there's a segment of our society, of our economy, that's doing great. Partly because of the, I think, very dangerous and unconventional interest rate policy that's been pursued by the Fed. We have had a huge appreciation in the value of a lot of assets, right? So if you have a lot of money invested in equities, stock markets are at nearly all-time highs. If you invested in fixed income securities, interest rates are at record lows, so bond prices are at all-time highs. A lot of categories of real estate, not all, but many, are at or near all-time highs. So if you are fortunate enough to have a lot of assets in those categories, or if you're involved in a business that is engaging in those activities, you're probably doing pretty well. Problem is, that's a very small percentage of Pennsylvanians and Americans. Big majority of Pennsylvanians and Americans, they're not wealthy people who get bailed out by the central bank with inflated asset prices. You know, we drove in on George Street and we passed some trucks that were pulled over on the side of the road, and the guys who were working there are the guys that pry the manhole cover off the manhole, they climb down into that manhole, and they pull a cable through a conduit. They splice it into another cable and they extend and repair the electrical grid. I know a little bit about that because that's a job my dad did for 30 years. For those guys, this economy really isn't working so well. Folks haven't seen the kind of recovery that we've been waiting for. In fact, we've had the worst recovery in 60 years. We've never had a recovery as bad as this one after a serious recession. We haven't had a single year in the last 8 in which the economy grew at 3%. That used to be average for our economy. The income gap has risen, wages have been stagnant, healthcare costs have gone through the roof, and we have a record low number of people even participating in the workforce for decades now. Now, there's some on the left that say, well, this is secular stagnation is the name they have given to this. And if you ask me, that is a complete cop-out. That is a suggestion that there's something inevitable, there's something normal that we simply have to accept about an economy that's growing at less than 2%, about an economy that is underperforming the American economy, what the American economy has achieved throughout the entire history of this country. I don't think there's anything normal about this. I don't think there's anything inevitable about it. I don't think there's anything natural about it, and we should not be settling for a weak economy that is underperforming for the vast majority of Pennsylvanians and Americans. I think it's the result of failed government policies. I mentioned one. I think this extremely unconventional monetary policy is actually doing more harm than good at this point. But we've also been through a period that's just unprecedented. Massive overspending, unprecedented deficits. In the last 8 years, we've doubled the nation's debt. We've hit the economy with an avalanche of new regulations like we have never seen before. And in my view, the cumulative weight of all this easily explains the difference between a strong recovery that's normal for America and the really weak recovery that we've lived through. So I am convinced, the good news in this is that I'm completely convinced that a booming economy and restoring the kind of prosperity is entirely within reach. We just got to get the policy right. We've got to recognize you can't spend your way to prosperity, you can't borrow your way to prosperity, you can't tax your way to prosperity. This avalanche of regulations got to be pushed back. If we restore the conditions that allow entrepreneurs to flourish and small businesses to grow, it also creates the jobs that put upward pressure on wages and allow people to have a higher standard of living. That is what awaits us if we get the policy right. Now, I've got an opponent in this race who completely disagrees. Katie McGinty is an advocate for all of the policies that got us here. She wants to double down on what I see as remarkably failed policies. She has advocated over $1 trillion in new government spending programs. She is a big fan of Obamacare and thinks we need to go further. We should have the government take complete control as a single-payer model. She supports all of these huge regulations, a big fan of Dodd-Frank. Let me just say two things about Dodd-Frank, because it goes to the core of why I think this is badly flawed legislation. You know, in 2008, we had a financial crisis. The government went in and bailed out all of these giant banks, hundreds and hundreds of billions of your money that went into these big banks. And what Dodd-Frank does is Dodd-Frank specifically codifies in Title II of that legislation the mechanism by which we got to do it all over again if banks fail again. How can that be right? How can that be okay? So I've introduced the legislation that repeals that and makes the reforms to the bankruptcy code so that if big banks get in trouble, they can go under. And the people who should suffer the losses are shareholders and unsecured creditors. That's the way our economy is supposed to work, not taxpayers. But Katie McGinty is all for it. Or take the effect that Dodd-Frank is having on community banks. I mean, everybody in this room, I think, probably understands this very well. Community banks, they serve their community. That's what they're called. They take deposits and they turn around and they make small loans to Sal's Pizza Shop and Harry's automotive repair shop and the local HVAC contractor. They provide the money to build a new walk-in cooler or buy a new Ford F-150. They provide those small loans that allow small businesses to start, to thrive, to grow. And Goldman Sachs is not interested in making that $25,000 loan. But community banks do it. Well, before Dodd-Frank came along, for 15 years or so, America used to launch 125 new startup community banks across the country every year, on average. More in good years, fewer in bad years. 125 per year was the average, and these little banks helped drive growth in their communities. From the time that Dodd-Frank was signed into law in the summer of 2010 through this afternoon, more than 6 years later, the United States of America has launched 2 new community banks. Now, how many hundreds of thousands of small businesses haven't been launched because they couldn't get credit, couldn't get capital? How many millions of jobs weren't created because we've just overregulated this sector of our financial services economy that had nothing to do with the financial crisis? This is what I'm talking about when I say the damage that overregulation has done. So Katie McGinty and I have very, very different views about the level of regulation, in my view, the harm that it's done. And so we've got different ideas about what we should do going forward. I will say the contrast between our views on security issues is every bit as stark. I am very concerned that the world has become a much more dangerous place than it was even 8 or 10 years ago. We are arguably engaged in 5 wars right now, if you include the non-shooting war, but the cyber war that Russia has been consistently waging against us. And I think there are serious threats. Some of them are overseas, some of them menace us here at home. For instance, the Iran nuclear deal, I think, was a huge, huge mistake. We handed over $100 billion to the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, and they've taken that money, and among the many other things they've done with that, they've continued to fund terrorism. As a matter of fact, their proxies in Yemen have been firing on American warships, literally firing missiles at American naval vessels. If they hit one of our ships, it could kill dozens or scores of American sailors. Where do you think the Houthi rebels get the money to launch those missiles? Almost certainly from Iran. We gave them over $100 billion. Oh, and by the way, it's for a promise that they're going to abandon their nuclear weapons program. Do you realize that as we gather here this afternoon, the Iranian parliament has not ratified that agreement? No Iranian government official has signed that agreement. They don't consider themselves bound by that agreement, which might explain why they're in serial violation of the agreement. And if they actually intended to abandon the pursuit of nuclear weapons, then you might want to ask, why do they spend millions of dollars testing precision-guided ballistic missiles that are designed to carry nuclear weapons? This is a very, very dangerous agreement in my view. Katie McGinty's all for it, I'm not. Sanctuary cities are another example of very, very badly misguided policy in my mind that my opponent and I just disagree on. I mean, sanctuary cities are those cities that establish as their official legal policy a prohibition that prevents the local police from cooperating with federal immigration officials. Even in the case of detainees who are violent criminals, concerned that they might be terrorists. But we confer a special legal privilege on them because they came here illegally, and in the city of Philadelphia, they get released back onto the streets if the city doesn't have enough evidence to prosecute on whatever they pick them up. They get released even when the Department of Homeland Security has asked the city to hold them until they can be taken into custody, and as a result, we've had some heinous crimes committed by people who were known to be violent criminals, known to be here illegally, but willfully released back onto the streets because Philadelphia is a sanctuary city and refuses to cooperate with our federal immigration officials. So I think this makes no sense at all. Last thing I want to mention is, none of us know for sure how this election is going to turn out. Nobody knows how the presidential race is going to turn out. Nobody knows how the Senate race turns out. But it's certainly looking increasingly like Hillary Clinton has a very good chance of being the next president. I'm not happy about that, but that does seem to be where this might be heading. So we've got a very, very difficult environment we're in. We've become very polarized. There's a tremendous partisan divide. And the question is, if Hillary Clinton becomes president, do we want somebody who is going to be a rubber stamp for her policies? Katie McGinty was asked and could not name a single policy area in which she disagrees with Hillary Clinton. I've been very critical of the person that my party has nominated. I've been very critical of Hillary Clinton. I will stand up to a president of either party when I think they're wrong. And I just don't think we have seen evidence that Katie McGinty would do that. I've also been able to work with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to have some successes despite the challenging polarization in Congress. The Jobs Act that Mike alluded to in the introduction, that was mostly on the Republican side of my legislation. On the Democrat side, Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer and I don't agree on that much. We might have a hard time agreeing that today's Wednesday. But we both agreed that there was excessive regulation that was impeding the ability of small growing businesses to access the capital markets. We streamlined it, we changed the rules so they can move more quickly, and as a result, small companies are raising capital more readily than they could in the past, and that's creating jobs. Sherrod Brown, liberal Democrat from Ohio, again, lots of disagreements with Sherrod Brown, but he and I worked together on this terrible opioid crisis, and we passed legislation that will reduce the diversion of prescription opioids into the black market. That's constructive. I worked with senators on both sides of the aisle to help keep our kids safe from predators in school, prohibiting the horrendous practice of knowingly recommending for hire predators as a way to just get them out of the school. And we actually had a good run late last year of modest features in the tax code that we made permanent that are good for small business and economic growth. Things like allowing small businesses to expense capital purchases so that they can more readily afford the expansion that they need. So, look, these are some of the things we've done. I have been working as hard as I can to make progress where we can. We've had a tough 8 years by most standards for most people. And I think, as I said, it's because of flawed policies that we have seen come out of Washington. But as we approach the election, I'm reminded of the wisdom of the great Winston Churchill, who said about all of us, he said, you can always count on the Americans to get it right after they've exhausted every other possible option. Well, I think we're tired of exhausting the other options. I think we're going to get it right. I'd be very grateful for your support on November 8th. Thank you very much. happy to take a few questions if anybody has a question. Yes, sir.
I have two questions unrelated to each other.
Okay.
One, I happen to be in favor of tax cuts like you are. But how are we going to reduce the debt if we're cutting taxes? And the second one, if you're wrong and Trump gets in, if we have a Republican Senate and House, do you think you can control it?
Interesting questions, both. I think a reform of our tax code, so our tax code is, I think, a huge impediment to growth right now. It is wildly inefficient. People spend literally trillions of dollars just complying with it, just figuring out. I mean, I was in the restaurant business for years. This is not a complex business. It's a hard business, but it's not complex. You buy raw food, you cook it, you sell it. You get paid immediately. It's just not that complicated. Our tax reform, our tax returns, it was a document that was like this thick. And what can you do? You sign the top, you write the check, and you hope for the best, because you have no idea. But you can't possibly know whether it's all right. You trust your accountants and your tax preparers. This is ridiculous. And we are at a competitive disadvantage, and it is unfair. So I think if we reform our tax code properly, lowering marginal rates, wipe out the crony corporate welfare that's rife throughout the tax code, we will have very strong economic growth. I think that's actually a part of getting our fiscal house in order, because with stronger growth, we'll have a bigger economy on which to base our taxes, and we can bring in more revenue. And we've done that in the past when we reformed the tax code. But there's no getting away from the fact that the big entitlement programs of our country are on an unsustainable path. I've acknowledged that. My opponent won't. But we've got to do something about them. Now, I'm not interested in making any changes for someone who's already retired or near retirement. That would be really terribly unfair, and we shouldn't do that. But these big programs need to look different for someone who's 30 years old when they retire. We're going to have to change, modify these programs. I think most 30-year-olds agree with that. But we've got to do that so that we can bend the cost curves and reduce the rate of growth of these programs. As far as, look, if Donald Trump becomes elected president, I think actually there's some legislation that he would probably sign. I think he'd probably sign a tax reform bill. I think he'd probably sign a repeal of Obamacare. I think he might be willing to restore sanctions on Iran, which we badly need. But I still have a lot of serious reservations about him for the many, many things he's said that I strongly disagree with, positions that he's taken that I think are wrong, serious questions about his temperament. So it's a dilemma for me. I do think the Senate and the House ought to be very assertive and provide the leadership. The House put together a very good agenda program. Many of us in the Senate have embraced the vast majority of that. We've got an agenda that we're ready to roll out that would be very pro-growth, and I think we should take the lead and do that. Yes, sir.
I watched your debate on Monday night, and I see it was just a warm-up act for your great presentation today. But I'd like to ask you specifically, it was helpful to see you and your opponent on the same stage debating the issues. But I have a friend who doesn't let his 11-year-old son watch the presidential debates. And I'd like your opinion about your debate and the presidential debates.
I think some of the language and the things that have happened and been said in this presidential election are appalling. It's embarrassing. Look, I've got the same concern. I worry. I have to turn off the TV. So I have a 6-year-old son. 6-year-old son, and I'm worried about what's going to come on the TV next. It's just terrible. So I'm very, very disappointed with that. I'm very disappointed with the choices that we have. We have 300 million people. I can't believe these are the two choices. And we have 300 million people. I'm sure we have better choices in this room, and yet there's 300 million others too. So it's frustrating. It's disturbing. I want to talk about issues. That's why I challenged Katie McGinty to do 5 debates all across the state. Do one in the Northeast, one in central Pennsylvania, do one up in the Northwest, as well as Philly and Pittsburgh. She wouldn't agree to that. And I think that's unfortunate, because that would have given us a better chance to delve into the details of our substantial policy disagreements. Yes, sir.
There's the overtime rule that goes into effect on December 1st. It affects adversely a lot of nonprofits and small businesses. Any prospect of change or relief on that?
Yeah, this is a rule that changes the rules on overtime, and of course, it's pitched as a way to elevate the incomes of people who have relatively modest incomes. The problem is, there's no free lunch, and I've had not-for-profits come in and tell me, if this happens, we are going to lay off workers. We are going to have to reduce our workforce. We're going to cut back hours, or we'll ratchet down the pay rate so that when you get to the math is all done at the end, the cost is still the same. So this, again, it sounds great, it's well-intentioned, I suppose, but it has a counterproductive effect. I think the answer to your question is it probably depends somewhat on the outcome of the election. If Republicans continue to control the Senate, then Democrats might be open to working with us on modifying this. If not, then I don't think there's any chance of doing anything about it.
Very good.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for the service that you had been providing and the struggle.
Would you stand, please? Yep. Thank you.
I say thank you for the service you've been providing and the struggle that you have been serving in success. I have a futuristic concern where we're going in this country. With the debt that we continue to pile up, and you talked about the economy, the number of people in job force. There's no question that we will continue to pile up debt, as has happened in European countries and other places. I expect sometime in the future, in our lifetime, we will see the federal government dip into our bank accounts. This is why they want to go to a cashless society, so that they have track of every dollar that we have, and they'll just skim off the top. Now, I think you're going to stand there and say that can't happen, but it's happening in other places. Why would it not happen here?
So, the short version of the question is, why should I be confident that the federal government won't simply confiscate people's savings as a way to deal with the really unsustainable fiscal crisis we've gotten ourselves into? Look, believe me, I am not downplaying the extent of the fiscal crisis. We now have total debt that exceeds 100% of GDP. The debt that's held outside the government by the public is 80% of GDP. We've never had this kind of debt except in wartime, and that was after World War II. We very rapidly paid it down. There's at least twice the level of debt that we have historically averaged, and countries that go down this road, things generally do not end well. The reason I don't think there'll be an explicit asset confiscation mechanism is because the government has other tools by which they can deal with this that are, shall we say, less overtly hostile to American savers. What they'll do is monetize it. It will be in cooperation with the central bank. They'll just print the money. And then our currency is debased. They've already been doing some of this, by the way. And our currency will be debased, and we'll see very high rates of inflation. This is what has historically happened. And that way, nobody actually sees the money evacuated from their bank account, but of course, the value of the money diminishes dramatically, and it is actually economically equivalent to having the money taken from you. That's what happens if we don't get this sorted out. This is why I feel very strongly about this. And right now, folks, I'm concerned that we're lulled into this complacency by this very artificial zero interest rate environment. We've taken on a mountain of debt, and it's like, oh, no big problem. Our interest cost isn't very high. No, because the Fed has engineered interest rates at zero. One day, whether we like it or not, interest rates will normalize. And when they do, the cost of serving this debt is going to be absolutely monstrous. This is why there actually is an urgency to fix this now, while we've got this window of opportunity, before the inevitable normalization of interest rates. Because if we wait until then our choices are very, very few, and they are sudden and draconian, and none of us want to be in that position. So it is really important that we get our fiscal house in order soon.
Last question.
Last question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I was wondering, in our country, 1 in 5 folks have a mental health diagnosis.
I'm sorry, have a what?
Mental health diagnosis. 1 in 5 people have a mental health diagnosis, and the rate of substance use is very high. If you look at the back from any other coverage, and insurance companies dictate how long people can be treated. 1 in 5 is really high, and it goes back to your economic question. These are folks that could be functional and aren't because of their mental health or substance use. We have low rates of recovery, and low ability as a clinician to treat folks. We're diagnosing kids as young as 6 with bipolar disorder, which is far different than in the past. Our institutions have changed from state mental hospitals to Homestead, where we weren't keeping folks in hospitals, but we didn't give community resources to do community care. And our institutions that are currently working with folks with substance use and mental health are most important.
We need to get to the question.
Most importantly, prisons, which are funding jobs in rural areas in the federal prisons. So how are you planning on addressing all of these very complicated systemic issues?
Yeah, look, it's a fair and it's a good question, and it is a huge problem. And you're right. In the absence of the state institutions that in the past had played this role, now mental health challenges end up being the problems of our schools, our police, the tremendous crisis of opioid abuse and drug overdoses are very, very closely associated, not always by any means, but often it's tied with a simultaneous mental health issues. Tim Murphy, Republican House member from Pittsburgh, is I think the House's only licensed psychologist, and he's put a lot of time and work into legislation that will try to deal with this in a comprehensive way. And it is a rising priority that we get this done. I'm not sure that we can get the legislation done this fall in the lame duck session, but I think his legislation, and there's a companion legislation in the Senate, and I think that it's very likely that it'll see floor time, debate, amendments, and I hope we can pass. I think Tim is on the right track, and if we get something done, I think we could probably do it next year, and I would hope that whoever's president would sign it into law, because it's true, this is a very big problem. It's a big challenge for our country. I think we're out of time, but I really appreciate your welcoming me back. Despite having heard me twice before, you still extended the invitation, which is a sign of kindness or lapse of judgment. I'm not sure which, but in any case, I am grateful. Thank you very much for having me.